Hello, this is Erica with Launching Legacies. Welcome to our daily devotional. Today I am asking the question, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? And this devotional series is dedicated to finding the man in your fear. And we'll talk about what that means, but we'll reference a scripture from Matthew 10:28 where it says that we don't need to be afraid of a man who can kill our body, but we should be afraid of God who can destroy our soul, right? And so that's the reference that we're going to use, but we're going to talk about, kind of unpack this concept of fear. And so remember, the question that you should be asking yourself, or maybe you already know the answer instantly, is what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Okay, so finding the man in fear. So every time I struggle with fear in particular, I have a strategy that I adopted a few years ago, maybe now almost more than 10 years ago, I suppose. And what that strategy is to face fear, because I don't like the discomfort of not being free to do whatever it needs to be done. I don't like to have a fear hinder me from freedom, because I just don't think that it should be that way. And so when I face a fear and it seems to preclude me from moving forward in any particular direction, then I use this strategy. And this is how the strategy works. I basically face the fear, right? So I recognize, okay, I'm afraid of something. Okay, I'm afraid of something. Let's say, for example, I was afraid of heights. I was afraid of being in high places, didn't like it, troubled me. And I just didn't like what it felt like. And so there were certain places or certain things I just didn't want to do because of this fear of heights. And so I was afraid of heights, and my mother, let my mother tell it, I had this fear from when I was a young child. Like I just didn't want to cross drawbridges or do things that had this elevation over empty space. I just didn't like it. But at some point I realized that it was hindering the freedom that I wanted for my life. And so I decided that, you know what, I'm going to go, went to an amusement park with someone who I don't think was really aware of my fear. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go to this amusement park and I'm going to ride every ride that this person suggests. And I'm not going to protest, and I'm not going to do whatever. And if I cry, I'm just going to put my head down and wipe my tears. And I'm going to go forth and ride these roller coasters, because the roller coasters have these high drops, and the drops are the things that were the most fearful things in the roller coaster. Not really the ride, but coming from high positions to low positions scared me. And so I decided to do that and challenge it. And my fear lessened with that. But then I took other challenges over time and did some really daring, what people may think dangerous things to overcome these fears. And once I had done it, I realized that when I was in high places, after trying to overcome these fears, I still experienced the feeling of being intimidated by high places. However, once I experienced this intimidation, I realized I had overcome the feelings that were connected to it before, so I could overcome it again. And so it wasn't, and I explained this to my daughter, who she did a fear challenge this past week, but I explained to my daughter that no, we were standing in a line for a roller coaster and she was trying to get over this fear. And I said, oh no, I still experience the same feeling of fear that you are probably experiencing, but I know I've beaten that before. So it's not something new and novel. It's something that is old and passé. I've already passed this place. I've already overcome this place. I felt this way. I did something even though I felt this way, and I survived. So I'm okay now, right? And so she's like, oh. Well, at first it didn't comfort her because she was like, well, you're afraid too. And I'm like, well, yeah, but that's human. That's a natural position, is that you're going to be concerned. You're going to be intimidated. You're going to feel a certain way. That doesn't necessarily lessen. I mean, it's less now on a roller coaster than it was 10, 15 years ago, but you're going to experience the same thing. It's whether or not this is a familiar place for you, right? And if it's familiar and you've already overcome it, then you've already overcome it. So there's not a lot to say about what you've already overcome. It's already been done. And so that was my strategy for overcoming fear, realizing that it may always be present, but just because it's present doesn't mean it hasn't been overcome. And so you just kind of pass over it and go through it and just Okay, it's been done. And so that's how I have dealt with fear in the past. But as I was preparing for this devotional, in particular, this series on fear, I realized that, yes, that's a great strategy for overcoming fear, really, because it's really, the fear has intimidation in it. And the intimidation is what you need to really kind of get over for most people who struggle with fear. And now we're not talking about phobias. We're not talking about some extreme fears. Right now, we're just talking about surface fears, things that people just, I don't like it. I don't want to do it. I don't, if you desensitize yourself to it, then you won't be as intimidated by it. And if you're not as intimidated, then you'll be able to overcome. That's basically that strategy. But what I want to pose to you when I ask you, what are you afraid of? If that strategy may work, but what is behind the fear? Because there is almost always this element of man in fear. And I hadn't actually thought about it so intently until I started reviewing and preparing for this passage. And I knew this passage from Matthew 10 is also found in Luke. And I knew that the word said, look, you don't need to be afraid of man who can take your life. Be afraid of God who can condemn your soul to hell. Like, they're nobody. Who are they, right? Look, if you're going to be afraid of something, if you're going to waste fear on something, then you should put it on something that's important. And I thought about, why would God have to approach it? Well, we'll talk about the context of the scripture later, but here goes what I want to pose to you. In this posing of this question, then I thought to myself, how often does fear involve man? How often is what we think a generalized fear really connected to some situation or a human being, like a man, not a man male, but a man, human? And I thought, how often is it connected to this concept of man? And if we find the man part of it, the human part of it, are we able to then overcome it by just identifying and finding the man in our fear? And then, so let me explain how that works. So when we get to this place of interacting with people. So some people have a fear of public speaking, right? They don't want to get in front of people, and they don't want to have anything to say. Well, their fear clearly is connected to man, because their issue has to do with being in front of people actually speaking, right? And so when they look at that fear of public speaking, they're really dealing with the fear of speaking in front of man. And so what they have to do with the people in that case of the fear is they have to figure out why people and talking in front of them becomes such a big hindrance, and overcome this, in essence, this fear of speaking in front of man. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But what about like my fear of heights? What did man have to do with my fear of heights? Is there a man in that concept of fear? And I'm just going to propose to you that I think that there is. And so when I started to look at that fear of heights, what I didn't like was being in a high place yet and not having control. And when I went back in prayer and meditation, I thought about, well, what about not being in control made me feel insecure? Well, of course, I'm not in control, so I can't make things happen the way I want them to happen. And almost instantly, I was brought back to a memory in which there was no control. There was chaos or disorder or disorganization amongst people or in my environment, and how that felt or what it resulted in was traumatic. And that feeling of trauma was associated with this feeling of being in high places without me being able to stabilize where I was. And so there was a direct connection, for me at least, between the heights and these experiences that I had with men when men were out of control or not in control in a way that made me feel safe. And so maybe if somebody was bear hugging me and I was in a high place, I might feel better. Maybe if people were with me or holding my hand, and I would feel better, because these people would make me feel more comfortable. And so I thought to myself, well, if man is in that fear, then how do I translate this understanding of man being in this fear to recognizing that if the word says don't fear man because he's not as powerful as God, how can I put God then in place of man to overcome the fear? And that's the question I'm actually going to pose to you. And we're going to continue with this devotional series for the rest of the week. Now, this may seem unorthodox, and maybe you don't even necessarily agree with it, and that's fine if you don't. Again, remember, send me messages. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. We're all over the place. You can send me messages and talk to Launching Legacies about it. Our handle is Launching Legacy. So you can send us messages, you can friend us, whatever you want about this topic as we go through the week. But I want you to think about it. What are you afraid of? And can you find man in your fear? Because the scripture clearly implies that there's somehow this fear of man is a common thing. But God is telling us to abandon the fear of man, recognizing that God is clearly more powerful. He's not trying to intimidate us, telling us he's going to take your soul to hell. That's not actually what he's trying to do in this scripture. But what he's saying is recognize that man on the continuum of things compared to God, man is nothing. Right? No person to be feared. No reason to be cowering away. And if we're able to find the man in our fear, then we're able to overcome every fear. Why? Because there is a love component that's going to come in, but there's all these other dynamics to it. And so as we unpack it over the week, here goes what I want to ask you to do. For one, I want you to read the passage in Matthew 10, the verses 28, but you can read that whole Matthew 10 chapter. That'd be great. So you'll have context. But then also, I want you to think about, what are you afraid of? And can you find the man in your fear? We're praying for you. Well, we hope that you're praying for Launching Legacies, because we need your prayers. And we'll ask you to see us again tomorrow with another of our devotionals. Until then, be blessed.